Unimpeached.
We stand by that.
Do you stand by your assertion and your Nature piece that SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct? Could not be?
We do, and that's exactly the same
Couldn't possibly be.
conclusion that the intelligence community came to.
Oh, no,
Sir,
that is a lie. Let's stop right there.
Well,
that is a lie. I have read the intelligence community did not come to that conclusion. Multiple intelligence community agents and components have concluded it was likely a lab leak. And they concluded that at the same time that you and your people were propagandizing the American public and using the channels and influence of the American government to censor ordinary Americans. Yeah. That is the truth. I'm not going to sit here and allow you to lie any further. Dr. Garry, you have disgracefully participated in shameful propaganda.
Senator Hawley, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing. Thanks for the witnesses for being here. You know, I have to say, I think one of the worst things that happened in the COVID era is that our own government deliberately withheld information from us, from the American people, tried to propagandize the American people, used the arms and agencies of government to actively censor Americans who dared to question the propaganda, and they're still lying to us. And I'll give you the proof of it. I wrote the bill that requires the administration to declassify the intelligence assessments and reports related to the origins of COVID-19. Now listen, I just want to say, everybody sitting on this dais has read these. I've read them. I guarantee you my colleagues have read them. I know what the Energy Department concluded. I know what the FBI concluded. I knew what they concluded years ago because we could read them when people like Dr. Fauci were out there saying the lab leak hypothesis was totally discredited and nonsense. You could go read the intelligence and know our own government thought otherwise. And at this late hour, this government still refuses to release the intelligence. They are blatantly disregarding the law that this body passed, the Senate passed, unanimously. The propaganda involved in the origins of COVID-19 is astounding to me. It recalls the worst of the wartime propaganda in years past when the government would deliberately lie to people. And here that's what they have been doing with COVID-19 and are still doing it. You know, you had this whole cabal led by Dr. Fauci and others who, as soon as the lab leak hypothesis that we now know is a lot more than a hypothesis, as soon as it's mentioned, what did Fauci do? We know because this has all been litigated in a federal district court. In fact, in multiple federal courts. I've got the finding of fact from the court right here. They lay it all out. Fauci goes to the WHO, asks the WHO to intervene to discredit the lab leak. He then speaks against it multiple times from the podium at the White House. He then does countless media interviews. I mean, my gosh, what show has he not been on? He's still on TV, spewing this misinformation, as he would call it. But he did these multiple interviews where he says, no way, no how, lab leak not possible at all. And then he coordinates, and the whole federal government coordinates with the biggest tech companies in the world to suppress, and media companies, to suppress any American who would ask questions about it. It's absolutely disgraceful. Dr. Garry, you were part of this propaganda effort. I mean, you were right at the center of it. It's astounding. You wrote this piece, this Nature magazine piece, or whatever it was, that we've heard testimony here today, Nature Medicine, March 17th, 2020. We've heard testimony here today from other scientists on the panel that it's basically an opinion piece. You said at the time that definitively SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct, Of course, our own government, key agencies have concluded otherwise. And on the basis of this, Dr. Fauci and others cited this piece and went out to use it to mobilize our own government to censor people who ask questions about it. People lost their jobs because of this. They lost their jobs, they lost their standing, they were kicked off Facebook, they were kicked off Twitter. Do you regret being part of this effort, this propaganda effort?
Sir, I was simply just writing a paper about our scientific opinions about where this virus came from.
Oh, no, you weren't. You said in an email that we now have that you tried to withhold, but that we have, February 2nd, 2020, you wrote, I really can't think of a plausible natural scenario where you can get from the bat virus, or one very similar to it, to this. I'm quoting you, I just can't figure out how this gets accomplished in nature. It's stunning. Of course, in the lab, it would be easy.
Well, of course. And I actually figured it out. That's the whole point of that.
You figured it out? You wrote this while you were writing your propaganda piece, while you were writing your paper.
I wrote that somewhere around February 2nd.
It was exactly February 2nd. And you've testified that you were writing your proximal origin paper in early February. So you're saying that, what did it come to you overnight?
There was new data that
like
came in.
A revelation from God.
No. It's
overnight you concluded,
method.
I got it. I figured it out. I've figured it out. And now I can definitively rule out. It's amazing. Is that what happened?
It's just the scientific method.
Oh, it's just science. Oh, it's the scientific method that happened at lightning speed and then was used to propagandize and lie to and shut down. As a scientist who's supposedly supposed to follow facts, do you regret the fact that your work was used to censor your fellow scientists? It was used to censor ordinary Americans who ask questions about the virus? Do you regret that?
When you write a paper, I mean, you get it in the journal. We can't control what happens after.
Oh, I see. So you're not responsible at all. It's amazing. Nobody who is involved in any of this is responsible. Never. Yeah. They're not responsible. Yeah, people have lost their jobs.
Yeah.
People have lost probably their health care associated with their jobs. People have been run out of public, they're not available in polite society. You can't show your face because, my gosh, you question. Yeah. But you don't have anything to do with it. Why have so many of your papers, your other papers, been retracted or subjected to formal expressions of concern?
Yeah, well,
why is that?
There's a long story behind that.
Four of them, right? I mean, you've had in July 26, 2021, Virology retracted a paper of yours. Also in 2021, the Journal of General Virology retracted another of your papers. In March of 2022, an expression of concern was added by an editor of yet another journal to another of your papers. In April 4th of 2024, a third scientific paper of yours was retracted from the Journal of Medical Virology. Yeah. Is this normal?
Those papers didn't come from my lab, but I'm certainly helping.
They're not yours?
They're not mine, no.
Oh, so your
I'm
your
on
work
the paper, but they did not come from my lab.
The work that God gave you in a flash of inspiration remains absolutely unimpeachable, unimpeached.
We stand by that.
Do you stand by your assertion in your Nature piece that SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct? Could not be?
We do, and that's exactly the same
couldn't possibly be
conclusion that the intelligence community came to.
Oh, no, sir, that is a lie. Let's stop right there.
Well,
that
right
is a lie. I have read the intelligence community did not come to that conclusion. Multiple intelligence community agents and components have concluded it was likely a lab leak. And they concluded that at the same time that you and your people were propagandizing the American public and using the channels and influence of the American government to censor ordinary Americans. Yeah. That is the truth. I'm not going to sit here and allow you to lie any further. Dr. Garry, you have disgracefully participated in shameful propaganda that has been one of the worst chapters in this country's history, with the government propagandizing its own people. And you know what? You may be right about I'm not a scientist. I don't know. But what I do know is, it is wrong. It is wrong to censor and lie to the American public. It is wrong to withhold critical information from them. Yeah. And it is wrong to countenance that and to say, oh, I just had nothing to do with it. Gee, I wish we could have done better. You should have done better, sir. You should have done better. And because you didn't, people have suffered. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Could I
Dr. Garry, if you'd like to respond, I think he can respond to your question.
Yeah. So, actually, Senator Hawley, I'm going to agree with you about something. I do think that we should learn more information from the intelligence community, what they found. I agree with you that they should be more open and tell where those conclusions came from, at the FBI and at the Energy Department. All the agencies should come forth with more information. So there's a point we can agree with. I mean, that was an interesting exchange, but all we did was write a paper, Nature Medicine, and 3,000 words. It's been one of the most scrutinized papers in history. It's held up very well. It wasn't an attempt to distort things and to mislead the American public. It was just simply a paper, like the many other scientific papers that I've written in my career.
Ranking Member Paul, you're recognized for questions.
Dr. Garry indicated that the intelligence community was somewhat unified, or a lot of them believe this came from animals, and that's just not true. The ones that have been vocal about this and talked a lot about it have been the DOE, which has more scientists than any other agency in Washington, probably other than NIH. They've concluded that it did come from the lab. FBI concluded it came from the lab, and we have a whistleblower from the CIA that says the scientists that were convened to study this voted 6-1 to say it came from the lab, and then they were overruled by superiors for political reasons. So there's a lot of evidence that people within the intel agencies actually do believe that there is evidence that it came from the lab. In addition to people getting sick, there's also about a week in October where they do imagery of who's using a cell phone, and nobody's using a cell phone in the lab for about a week. So the lab's completely empty for about a week, and some people think that was during a cleanup period. But if you're sitting at home and you're sort of an independent, you hear scientists over here saying gain of function is the best thing since sliced bread, and over here you're saying, well, we really haven't developed any meaningful vaccines or technology from this, you're like, who do I believe? And who you believe does go to character. And so we have to look at some of the statements. Like I say, I've never seen anything like this between public and private statements. So Christian Anderson, early on in this, sends an email to Fauci. And as Fauci says, Bob Garry, and a couple of the other virologists, we think it's inconsistent. This virus, this genetic sequence of COVID is inconsistent with the expectations of evolutionary theory. So they believed it didn't come from nature. They had looked at this. These are smart people that when they were not looking at it, when they were trying to look at it through an objective lens, concluded one thing until they came to another conclusion that it might hurt the business of science and the arrangements they had going on with China, and concluded opposite. But with Christian Anderson, it's stark because he says, Bob and all these, we all believe it's inconsistent with the expectations of evolutionary theory. A week later, Christian Anderson is saying, what I like to use when I talk to the public is I like to tell them it's consistent with the expectations of evolutionary theory. So he goes from inconsistent to consistent, complete opposite approach within days, maybe even simultaneously as these papers are being written. So really the hypocrisy of those involved and those who are saying not a laboratory construct, if you want to know who to believe, look at their private statements versus their public statements. So we have gain of function is the best thing since sliced bread, or gain of function is a real problem. Now, Senator Romney's like, well, why does it matter if there's a chance we should do something? I think he's right. If you believe there's a 1% chance we should do something. But if you think there's a 1% chance, or you want to sort of glad hand people at the end and say, well, we should do something, their argument for the people who think it's not likely to happen is going to be, oh, the administration's already fixed this. It's already done, and all we need is a few little regulatory things. We don't need legislation. We don't need independent oversight. We don't need people looking at this who aren't on the receiving end of the money. This is the whole problem of NIH. The people regulating themselves are getting the money. So the administration has put in place some regulations to try to, help with the buying of select agents. And Dr. Quay, if you could explain to us what a few MIT scientists did recently and how well the administrative regulations are working without actual congressional legislation.
Sure. So 3 scientists at MIT said they were going to be a red team, and they contacted the FBI because what they were going to do was about to be potentially illegal. And they put together ricin and the 1918 influenza. Those 2 are select agents, and they're highly lethal. And they broke the genes up in a particular way. They added some benign genes, and then they put out test orders roughly following the White House guidelines, test orders to see if laboratories would send them the pieces they needed to build these viruses or ricin, or they would stop them. And in fact, in 94% of the time, they sent the pieces right to them. They purposely didn't make the active strain of the RNA. They made the inactive strain to show that they could do it. But they proved they could make ricin. They proved they could make the 1918 influenza under the guidance that have just come out of the White House in a way that
this gets at where we go forward. Our next hearing, or one of our next hearings, is going to be, what do we do for gain of function reform? What kind of committee do we set up to look at this? And if the answer is from the other side, oh, it's already done, the White House did it, this is showing you what the White House did, even if it was well-intentioned, didn't work. These scientists got the material off the internet to create the Spanish flu that killed 50, 100 million people. So this is not something we should scoff at and say, oh, it's not a laboratory construct. We don't do anything here. Let the administration do this. And I would say this if it were a Republican administration. I don't care which party it's in. I agree with scientists like Kevin Esvelt who equate this with nuclear weapons. This is incredibly important and needs congressional oversight on the select agents, but also on the gain of function. Now, some people think this just started. It's incredibly partisan. And I'll just for a quick answer, then a more extensive answer. Dr. Ebright, are you part of the right-wing conspiracy? Are you somehow some kind of crazy Republican partisan?
I'm a registered Democrat. I voted for Biden. I had a Biden sign on my lawn and had a Biden bumper sticker on my car.
That's enough of that. But the main point I wanted to make is this isn't a partisan thing. In fact, when I've talked to Dr. Ebright, he says he got involved with this after 9/11 when the anthrax attacks came. But then more involved in 2010 as it heated up, and everybody was talking about in the scientific community when scientists took the avian flu, which is very, very deadly in humans, but like most animal virus, not very transmissible in humans, and they mutated it, Fouchier and others in Netherlands, to make it spread through the air and to spread to mammals. That's a crazy thing. And if people think that's a benign use of gain of function, we should never, ever listen to people like that. Who else thinks it was benign and we didn't need to do anything? Anthony Fauci. There have been these two camps. There has been this debate going on for a decade. I think this is a very good debate. It should be an intellectual debate, but realize these are the people, Collins and Fauci, who were saying, take these people down. Take down the people we disagree with. This is not scientific debate. They were taking us off the internet. People are not playing under the American rules, not playing under the scientific method, and they should be discounted. But we have to have a real debate over this. So as we move forward, and I'd like to ask you, Dr. Ebright, on this, how important is it that we actually have a law passed and that we actually have regulators that are scientists, but that are outside of the supply of money, outside of the exchange of grant money?
I think it's a matter of survival. It's that important. There needs to be an entity that is independent of agencies that fund research and perform research to eliminate the structural conflict of interest that has existed with current self-regulation by agencies that perform and fund research.
Thank you.
Senator Johnson, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member for holding this very important hearing. We need a lot more of these. I want to thank all the witnesses for your very detailed testimony. And I'd encourage anybody viewing this hearing to go online and read the detailed testimony. I think you'll find it very difficult to not come away after reading that we may not have a smoking gun, but the circumstantial evidence is strong that this was a man-made virus and that it was probably leaked from a lab, probably at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. One thing that's convinced me very early on, I've been convinced this quite some time, is just the cover-up. I mean, the fact the Chinese took down data sets. So all of a sudden you couldn't find a smoking gun because it no longer exists, and we'll probably never know that. But also the cover-up here within the U.S. government. I've been doing oversight on our response to COVID, which, by the way, was a miserable failure. We're 4% of the world's population. We apparently experienced 16% of the deaths. We're supposedly the most modern medical system in the world. That's a miserable failure. And so we need to do a lot of oversight, not just on the origin, which is an important aspect of this, but on everything, okay? If we're serious about this, by the way, we got to start letting subpoenas start flying. I'll do this one more time. I've done this multiple times. This is the 50 final pages of Fauci's emails. By the way, the only reason we realize that Fauci was engaged in a cover-up with Dr. Garry is the fact that we had to FOIA these. They didn't turn these over, which they should have. We had to FOIA them. We had to go to court. Our staff has taken the 4,000 pages that we got that were redacted, narrowed those down to 400 pages, and they allowed us to look at these things unredacted in a reading room. 350 pages, but not the final 50. In terms of the cover-up, my guess is the smoking gun exists somewhere under these heavy redactions. So my suggestion, actually my plea to the chairman, is to issue a subpoena to get these final 50 pages, then maybe we'll get a full extent of the extensive cover-up. Dr. Garry, I don't know, have you ever used the word conspiracy theory as it relates to the lab leak? Have you ever accused people who put that thing forward, they're a bunch of conspiracy theorists?
Not in my public.
Okay, well, I tell you who has, is the chief editor-in-chief of Nature magazine that published the proximal origin. He said, talking about your study, your cover-up, great work. We'll put conspiracy theories about the origin of SARS-CoV-2 to rest. Will you at least admit that people who are raising the possibility of a lab leak were not conspiracy theorists, that they were legitimate concern about gain-of-function research creating this chimeric virus?
Of course, sir. I mean, that would include us at the very beginning.
That's progress. That's progress because, again, an awful lot of people's reputations were ruined by this cover-up and by the accusations of people being conspiracy theorists. Dr. Ebright, the purpose of this hearing really is to talk about the danger of gain-of-function research. Right now we're about ready to be scaremongered. I think we're already being scaremongered on H5N1. Back in late 2011, the world learned of two scientific teams, one in University of Wisconsin-Madison, one in the Netherlands, that had apparently said each of these labs created H5N1 viruses that had gained the ability to spread through the air between ferrets. The animal model used to study how flu viruses might behave in humans. That's pretty darn dangerous stuff, right? That is primarily what led to the moratorium on gain of function, correct?
That is correct.
What possible reason is there to be producing what nature probably couldn't produce? Why are we doing this?
It's important to emphasize that the research in question has zero civilian practical applications. Gain-of-function research on potential pandemic pathogens is not used and does not contribute to the development of vaccines and is not used and does not contribute to the development of drugs.
So again, that rationale for all this research is exactly that. In case we have to respond, but that's the rationale. In case we have to respond to a bioweapon attack, okay? We need a defense mechanism. So that's the reason, for example, the Defense Department has spent $42 million or funded EcoHealth Alliance for $42 million and USAID for $53 million, correct?
So the current definition is research that is reasonably anticipated to increase either the transmissibility or the virulence of a potential pandemic pathogen. That research does not contribute to developing countermeasures against potential pandemic pathogens.
That's the rationale they used. The thing they really scared the public on was the 1918 flu pandemic, correct? Even Anthony Fauci has admitted most people who died of the flu pandemic died of pneumonia because we didn't have antibiotics, correct?
Bacterial pneumonia.
I think one of the things we have to provide oversight is the sabotage of early treatment using widely available, cheap, and safe generic drugs. We didn't do that. I mean, from my standpoint, the first thing we ought to be doing in any kind of pandemic is there some way to treat this? And let doctors be doctors. Let them practice medicine. Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of Miller's ratchet, correct?
Of what?
Miller's ratchet. Okay, well, it's basically what viruses generally do is they'll become more transmissible but less pathogenic. Okay, because again, it doesn't do, a virus snuffs itself out. MERS snuffed itself out. SARS snuffed itself out, except there were a couple lab leaks that produced SARS outbreaks, correct? So again, my point is, are we making things worse with human intervention? Producing vaccines that are not sterilizing, that allow variants to be produced, and things like antibody-dependent enhancement. Again, there's an awful lot of concern that we don't even consider here because we're on this quest to have a vaccine for everything and produce vaccines for viruses that haven't even been created yet in the lab. Again, that's the question we ought to be asking this committee is, what in the world are we doing? What's the rationale for doing this, and are we actually causing more harm than good?
With vaccine development, I would disagree. The vaccines in general do not pose significant harms and offer significant benefits. With respect to the gain-of-function research, which creates new threats, biological threats that do not exist currently and might not naturally come into existence in a decade, a century, or a millennium, That research creates threats, and those threats are existentially risky threats. And that research is being conducted without a justifiable rationale. There is no rationale in terms of development of countermeasures. Industry develops vaccines and therapeutics against diseases currently in humans, not against diseases that don't yet exist and need to be made in a lab.
We could use a public debate regarding all things vaccine, the profit motive of it, and everything else, but that's for another day.